A dying widow traded her daughter for a single silver coin, but what the rancher did next left the whole town whispering in awe and disbelief. Out on the red-dusted edge of Deadwood Creek, where wildflowers tangle in sagging fence lines and the wind knows every secret, folks still talk about a quiet afternoon that changed everything. That day, a dying widow pressed her last silver coin into a stranger's palm and handed him her barefoot daughter. Nobody guessed the bargain would shake the whole town, or that one man's hard choice could turn regret into something close to hope. Out here, some debts are paid with kindness, not blood. The land was red clay and dust and wind, a kind that would work itself into your boots and under your skin, no matter how careful you were. Deadwood Creek was the sort of place you only found if you'd lost your way, and most folks who ended up there did so because they were running from something or someone, or because there was nowhere else to go. Grace Whitaker had been born here and never left, not for lack of wanting, but because the world outside had never given her so much as a sideways glance. She lived in a shack that leaned to the west, shingles loose, the door sagging, and every morning the sun rose on her hollowed face and the cough that shook her down to the bone. Her daughter, June, moved like a wild thing in the weeds, barefoot, legs dirty up to the knees, eyes too old for 9 years. Her hair was the color of burnt straw, tangled and cut with a knife, her dress a patchwork of whatever cloth Grace could beg or borrow. They shared the same silence, the same hunger. It had been weeks since the larder held more than beans and dried apples, months since anyone knocked on their door except to collect or threaten or tell some story of a better life. If only Grace would sell the last thing she had, her pride or her child. On the day it happened, the wind whipped down the hills, bringing with it the smell of distant rain and something sharper, change, or maybe just the edge of desperation. June sat on the porch step, toes digging into the warm dust, watching her mother pack the little she owned into a faded cloth sack. There was nothing in Grace's hands but a single silver dollar, wrapped in a scrap of handkerchief, and the way she held it made June's heart thump hard in her chest. A wagon rattled up the lane, a faded blue drawn by a mule with one white ear and a man at the reins who seemed made of bone and sunburn. Walker Hale had a reputation in Deadwood Creek, a rancher with no family, a temper that had came and went like a summer storm, and a history no one spoke about in the daylight. He wore a battered hat pulled low and boots caked in the memory of every trail he'd ever walked. When he stepped off the wagon, Grace stood and pressed the coin into his palm, not looking him in the eye. "You take her," she whispered, her voice thin, breaking. "So she lives. Don't let her turn into me." Walker's face didn't change. He looked at the child, then at the mother, then at the coin in his hand. "I ain't promising anything," he said. His voice was rough but not unkind. Grace only nodded, not trusting herself to speak again. Her lungs rattled with effort as she bent down and brushed a strand of hair from June's face. "Be good, baby," she said, and the way she said it made the world feel small and final. Then, as if she could vanish if she moved fast enough, she turned and started back down the lane, not once glancing over her shoulder. June didn't cry. She didn't move either, not until Walker set a hand on her shoulder, not heavy, but there. She glanced up at him, searching for something she wasn't sure she'd ever seen in a grown man's face, and saw only the squint of a man used to looking straight into the sun. He motioned to the wagon, and without a word she climbed up, the boards warm against her bare feet. The ride out of town was slow and bumpy. The dust rose behind them like a curtain, swallowing the shack, the past, her mother's bent shoulders. They crossed the flats, past the cattle that looked like shadows in the evening sun, toward a distant house where nothing seemed to stir. The ranch was spread wide and worn, every fence post splintered, the well creaking in the breeze. There was no dog, no welcoming face, just the scrape of Walker's boots and the way he nodded toward the barn, as if that was enough explanation. "You hungry?" he asked, not looking at her. June nodded, though the hunger was old and quiet now, part of her bones. He handed her a heel of bread and a chunk of salt pork, and she ate them in silence, watching the way the light died on the floor. That night she slept in the hayloft, curled up with a thin blanket, listening to the wind rattle the boards. She didn't think of her mother, not really, and she didn't cry. She counted the stars instead, let the ache in her chest settle somewhere she couldn't touch, and told herself she'd learn to live with whatever came next. Below her, the horses shifted in their stalls, and Walker sat on the porch, a shadow in the dark, staring out at nothing, a man alone with his own ghosts. The days in Deadwood Creek ran long and thin like shadows at sundown. June woke with the chickens, stiff from sleep, barn dust in her hair, and hunger curled quiet in her belly. Walker Hale was already outside, splitting kindling by the chopping block, his breath fogging in the pale morning air. He didn't greet her. He didn't need to. There was a rhythm to his movements, to the way he carried himself. Never rushed, never wasted. He handed her a tin cup of water, nodded toward the well. She drank, then watched him work, waiting for the world to tell her what came next. That morning she followed him to the pasture fence, where the wire sagged and the posts leaned tired against the wind. He handed her a pair of gloves that swallowed her. Hands showed her how to drive a stake, how to pull the wire tight without nicking her palms. June fumbled, cursed under her breath, tried again. Walker only watched, eyes narrowed but not impatient, saying nothing. When she spilled a bucket of water soaking her skirt, he didn't scold. When she dropped the pail of milk and watched it run white and wasted into the dirt, he just knelt and mopped it up, leaving her to the heat in her cheeks. The work was hard, the rules silent but ironclad. If she ate, she worked. If she worked, she slept. No one owed her comfort, but no one denied her food, or either. Nights were quiet, only the creak of the windmill and the distant howls of coyotes, sometimes close enough to raise the hairs on her neck. She lay in the loft, arms folded tight, listening to the horses shifting, letting the scent of hay and animals drown out the memory of her mother's goodbye. It wasn't long before a stranger returned to the ranch, a figure limping through the gate with dust on his boots and a battered hat pulled low. Ed, the hired hand, back from wherever men like him go when there's nothing left to keep them. His skin was brown as saddle leather, hair peppered gray, and the first thing he said was in Spanish, rough and unfriendly, eyeing June like she was a stray dog begging for scraps. "Who's this, Hale?" Ed asked, voice thick with suspicion. Walker just shrugged. "She's here, that's all." Ed snorted, spat in the dirt. He made a show of ignoring June, but the next morning she found a wedge of cornbread waiting for her on the fence post, still warm. When he caught her watching him, Ed muttered something about feeding skinny horses, not orphans, but he winked before turning away. Work settled into a pattern. June swept out the barn, fetched water, burned her fingers on the kettle. She learned to keep her head low and her ears open, to watch Walker's hands for the things he didn't say. Sometimes at dusk, he'd show her how to check the shoes on the gray mare, how to mend a split rail, how to carry herself like someone with a right to be there. But his eyes never softened. He lived with a distance, as if each kindness cost him something he couldn't spare. One night, rain blew in sharp off the plains, drumming on the tin roof until it sounded like 1,000 footsteps marching past the window. Walker came back late, boots caked with red mud, face drawn. He dropped a sack of bread and a jar of preserves on the table, then sat, staring at nothing. June knew something had happened, but she didn't ask. She took the bread, split it in half, left one piece wrapped in paper by the back door before she climbed up to the loft. She never saw him eat it, but in the morning, The paper was gone. News traveled on the wind in Deadwood Creek. The next day, Ed came back from town, hat in hand, eyes dark. "Grace Whitaker's taken a turn," he said, voice low. June stopped, the broom still in her hands. She looked at Walker, searching for mercy, for hope, but he just looked away. "Ain't nothing to be done," he muttered. Ed set a hand on her shoulder, awkward and gentle, and June shook him off, wiping her face on her sleeve when she thought they weren't looking. That night, June sat by the barn door, knees drawn up, watching lightning flicker in the hills. She thought about her mother, her cough, her laugh, the way she'd once braided June's hair with wildflowers. Her chest hurt in a way she didn't have words for. Walker stood on the porch, smoking, eyes lost in the dark. He didn't say a thing, but the next morning June found a small bundle of black bread wrapped in wax paper on the wagon seat. A note in clumsy letters, for Grace. She never saw him send it, but she heard the whispers in town. Walker Hale's gone soft, feeding ghosts. The sky stayed gray for days. Walker worked the fence line. Ed mended tack. June scrubbed dishes until her hands cracked and bled. No one spoke of Grace, or June's tears, or the coin that had changed everything. But every night, when the wind died and the world grew still, Walker would sit by the fire, shoulders hunched, as if carrying a weight that would never lift. When June drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of the red hills and the endless sky, of voices calling from far away, of choices made when no one else was watching. In the dark, Walker watched the flames flicker, his own regrets burning slow and silent. And so they lived, side by side. No promises, no forgiveness, only the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could learn not to leave each other behind. June never quite remembered the moment the ranch became more than a patch of dirt and chores. But she did remember the feeling, somewhere between hope and fear. The land stretched out in all directions, wind-pressed grass and stubborn mesquite. In the mornings, the air was cool enough to see her breath, the sky big and empty except for the slow turn of circling hawks. It was a place for men like Walker Hale, silent, hard-edged, alone by habit and by history. She spent those first weeks learning the rules that weren't written down. Walker taught her how to tie knots, chop kindling, haul buckets from the well without spilling a drop. Sometimes he'd stand behind her, arms folded, watching as she fought with a stubborn gate latch or fumbled a coil of rope. And when she failed, he'd say nothing, just give a single nod, and she'd try again. There were no gold stars, no praise. The only reward was being allowed to keep trying, and that was enough. Ed, the old hand, grew softer in the edges with time. He told her stories in the quiet of the barn, of wild horses and lost cattle, of towns burned and rebuilt, always ending with a lesson, though June sometimes missed the point. He showed her how to ride the little Mustang they called Blue, how to keep her heels down, back straight, reins easy. Blue wasn't much to look at, but he had fire in him, and when June laughed, really laughed, as the horse cantered beneath her, Ed grinned wide, a gap-toothed, sun-worn smile that made her feel less invisible. Still, there were moments that reminded June she was not at home. Walker rarely spoke more than a handful of words at a time. At meals, he'd pass the cornbread or beans without looking her in the eye. Nights in the barn were long, cold, and full of sounds. Rain tapping the roof, coyotes yipping, the distant echo of a train whistle. Some nights, June stared at the rafters until her eyelids ached, missing her mother with a sharpness she tried to swallow. One evening, a neighbor woman, Rose Fletcher, stopped by with a basket of apples and eyes sharp enough to slice bread. She looked June up and down, then shot Walker a look that needed no translation. "She's thin," Rose said, her voice lined with doubt, "and too quiet." "She's learning," Walker answered, his tone final. Rose stayed for coffee, watching June help Ed patch a saddle strap by lamplight. Later, as she left, she pressed June's hand in both of hers and whispered, "If you ever need a warm bed or a real meal, you come find me." June just nodded, not trusting her voice, but the warmth of Rose's touch lingered after the woman had gone. On Sundays, when chores allowed, Ed told stories about Walker's past, always in low tones, always with a glance to make sure the boss was out of earshot. "That man," Ed said, "once saved a boy from drowning in a flash flood, pulled him out and carried him 2 miles back to camp." He paused, scratching his jaw. "But he lost something of his own years ago, a little girl. Folks say he's been trying to fill that empty spot ever since." June tucked those stories away, like seeds in her pocket, not sure if they'd ever grow into anything. The loneliness softened a little, replaced by a routine that felt almost safe. But one night, with the wind rattling the shutters and the clouds heavy with rain, June found herself curled on her pallet, heart pounding from a nightmare she couldn't shake. She crept to the barn door and peered out. The house was dark, but she saw Walker's shape hunched on the porch, lit by a dying lantern. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Walker said, low and tired, "Best get some sleep. Chores come early." June wanted to ask if she was safe here, if she would ever really belong. Instead, she turned back to the barn, the grass cool and wet beneath her feet. Somewhere behind her, the door stayed open a little longer that night, and the porch lamp burned until the sky began to lighten. Days passed with the slow, honest rhythm of ranch life, each one stretching thin and quiet over the rolling red earth. June rose before dawn, the chill air nipping at her skin as she stepped outside, bare feet pressed into the dew-slicked dust. By now she knew the order of things. Gather eggs, check the fences, fetch water from the well, brush Blue until his coat gleamed silver in the early light. The little Mustang had learned to nuzzle her palm for oats, soft-eyed and patient, her first real friend on the land. But even as June settled into the work, she sensed the unspoken rules shaping everything between her and Walker. He never raised his voice, never lost his temper, but his silences had weight. A judgment, a test, or maybe just the way men who've been left behind choose to keep from caring too much. When June spilled the milk, he simply watched as it soaked into the dirt, eyes unreadable, then motioned for her to fetch another pail. If she stumbled with the firewood, he didn't help, just waited while she picked it up again. It wasn't kindness she wanted, not exactly. What she craved was certainty, a sign that she belonged, that she was seen. Most days it was Ed who gave her that, sneaking her extra cornbread or showing her how to mend her dress with a few quick stitches. He teased her gently, called her Chiquita in his rough accent, but there was a softness there, an understanding born of his own years spent drifting between other people's troubles. Sometimes Ed and Walker would talk in low voices by the paddock, words carried away by the wind, leaving June to guess at their meaning. She knew Ed hadn't always liked having her around. He was used to a certain quiet, a certain order. But one afternoon, as she chased a runaway chicken across the yard, Ed hollered after her, "Hold fast, Nina. Ain't no sense letting a bird outsmart you." When she cornered the hen at last and lifted it high, Ed whooped with delight, and Walker allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. The turning point, though, came late one night as a storm rolled down from the high mesa. Wind howling, rain lashing the roof in sharp, angry bursts. June cowered in the barn, clutching an old blanket, the horses restless in their stalls. She watched the lightning split the sky, her breath coming short, remembering another storm, another night when she'd pressed herself against her mother's side, seeking comfort that never came. The barn door flew open with a crash, and June jumped, heart hammering. Walker stood there, lantern in hand, soaked to the bone, face grim. "Come inside," he said, voice flat but not unkind. June hesitated, fear and hope wrestling in her chest, then followed him into the house. Inside, the fire blazed bright, painting the walls gold. Walker poured her a mug of hot tea, chamomile, edged with mint. He set it before her, then sat across the table, hands folded. For a long time, neither spoke. The clock on the wall ticked slow and loud, marking each heartbeat. Finally, June whispered, "Are you going to send me away too?" Her voice shook with something raw. Old wounds, fresh worries. Walker didn't answer right away. He stared at the fire, jaw tight, as if weighing words he hadn't spoken in years. "No," he said at last, quiet but certain. "You're here now. That's enough." June clung to that promise as the storm raged outside, sipping her tea in silence. Later, when she slipped off to bed, Walker left the door to her room ajar, letting the warm light spill into the hallway. That night, for the first time in a long while, June slept dreamless and deep. Word drifted through Deadwood Creek the way dust drifted on the wind, slow at first, then all at once, finding every corner, every ear. By the time the news reached the Hale Ranch, it was as if the land itself had gone a shade grayer. Grace Whitaker, the widow in the old shack, was dying. Some said she was already gone. Others claimed she was holding on for something, or someone left unfinished. June heard the whispers in town when Ed sent her to the mercantile for flour. Women gathered on the porch, baskets in their arms, pausing mid-sentence as she walked by. She kept her eyes on the ground, shoulders tight, but the words trailed her all the same. Poor girl, can't even say goodbye to her own ma. Never should have left that child to a man like Hale. She thought of her mother each night, the cough that rattled the thin walls, the way Grace's hand felt cool and calloused as she pressed that last coin into Walker's palm. She wondered if Grace missed her, if she'd forgiven June for not fighting harder to stay. The ache was sharp like a stone in her chest. She never spoke of it, but sometimes when the work was done and the others had gone quiet, she'd slip out to the edge of the pasture and sit in the grass, watching the stars, letting her grief run out in silence. Walker didn't mention Grace, not to Ed, not to June, not to anyone. But one evening, as the sky bled red over the hills, he rode into town with a bundle wrapped in burlap, returning late and wordless, boots tracking mud across the kitchen floor. June found the bundle missing from the wagon the next morning. Later she heard that a loaf of black bread and a bit of smoked meat had appeared at Grace Whitaker's door, and that someone had seen Walker Hale slip away before dawn, shoulders hunched against the cold. It was Ed who finally spoke what everyone else tiptoed around. He found June by the chicken coop, hands buried in straw, and stood a long moment before clearing his throat. "Your mama's real sick, Nina. Folks say she ain't got much time." June nodded, jaw clenched, not trusting herself to speak. "You want to see her?" Ed asked, softening. "I could ask Walker." June shook her head. "She wouldn't want me to see her like that. She sent me here so I'd be safe." Ed pressed a rough hand to her shoulder just for a moment. "You're a good girl, June. Don't forget that." That night, a quiet settled over the ranch. Walker sat on the porch, hat pulled low, gaze lost somewhere past the cottonwoods. June watched him from the window, wondering what ghosts kept him up so late, what regrets crept in when the world turned dark. She wrapped herself in her mother's old shawl and stepped outside, pausing at the steps, unsure if she was welcome. Walker didn't look up. "Cold night?" he said. June nodded, clutching the shawl tighter. "Colder than most." For a while they sat side by side, words unnecessary. The sky above, stretched wide and endless, stars flickering like the last hope of the dying. June thought of Grace, of the weight of her love, of all the things she'd never get to say. She closed her eyes and let the silence carry her, a comfort as real as any embrace. Inside, the fire burned low. June lay awake long after the house had gone still, listening to the wind, the creak of the old place settling into night. She imagined her mother out there, somewhere between here and gone, watching over her, hoping that the little girl with the dust-stained feet and stubborn heart would find a way to stay. The sky cracked open that night, thunder rolling heavy as a freight train across the mesa. Wind ripped at the shingles, rattled the barn doors, sent hay swirling through the loft, where June huddled beneath her blanket, the world outside raw with storm. Rain battered the roof, leaked in at the corners, ran in muddy lines down the walls. Horses stamped and snorted below, restless with fear. Each flash of lightning lit the rafters like daylight, shadows jumping wild and long. She tried to be brave, like Walker had taught her, chin up, eyes open, wait for the danger to pass. But the storm pressed in, fierce and relentless, and all her courage slipped away. When a crash split the darkness, the sharp, unmistakable crack of wood giving way, June bolted upright, heart pounding. She scrambled down the ladder, bare feet thudding on the boards, and ran through the wet to the house, hair plastered to her cheeks, breath coming in short, frightened bursts. Walker answered her knock quick, lantern in one hand, shotgun in the other. He didn't ask what she was doing there, didn't scold or question. He just stepped aside, let her in, then closed the door against the wildness outside. Inside, the house felt smaller, warmer, a shelter instead of a cage. Walker set the shotgun by the door and busied himself at the stove, fixing tea in silence. His hands moved steady, practiced, as if storms were nothing new. June stood by the fire, dripping on the rug, arms wrapped tight around herself. She watched the way Walker poured the water, how he set the old blue mug in front of her with the faintest nod. He sat across the table, eyes reflecting the flicker of the lamp, jaw working. For a while, the only sound was the pop and hiss of wet logs in the fire. June sipped the tea, hands wrapped around the mug for warmth, and the storm seemed a little less terrifying. When her voice finally came, it was small, but clear. "You ever get scared out here alone?" Walker didn't answer right away. He leaned back, boots crossed under the table, gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder. "Used to?" he said finally, his voice rough, with something that wasn't just the cold. "Now I mostly get tired of losing things, tired of running from what I can't fix." June pressed her lips together, fighting tears. "My ma, she sent me away so I'd have a chance. So I wouldn't end up—" Like her, Walker met her eyes, steady and solemn. "You ain't her, and you ain't me neither." She hesitated, then asked the question that had haunted her every sleepless night. "Are you gonna leave too?" He was silent for a long time, the clock ticking slow. Finally, he shook his head, not looking away. "I ain't leaving, not unless you tell me to." June's shoulders sagged with relief. She'd let herself believe him, just for tonight. They sat there, storm raging, but the worst of it stayed outside. Walker left the door to her little room ajar, and the lamp burned until the thunder faded to nothing. June slept in a bed that night, warm and dry, the sound of her name still echoing in Walker's promise. In the pale gray light of morning, the storm had spent itself. June woke to the smell of biscuits baking, the quiet hum of ranch life slowly beginning again. She found Walker in the yard, boots caked with mud, examining the collapsed corner of the barn. He didn't say anything about the night before, didn't have to. June fetched the hammer and nails without being asked, and together they set to work, side by side, mending what the storm had broken. The days that followed the storm settled into a new kind of rhythm. June found herself inside the house more often, the rooms no longer feeling so foreign or forbidden. She swept the kitchen floor, mended curtains that let in the wind, and learned the delicate art of not burning the beans on the stove. Walker watched her at work, silent as always, but something in his posture eased. Just a little, the way winter thaws before the first green. She learned to bake biscuits under Rose's sharp eye, the older woman appearing at the door with baskets of apples and questions wrapped in suspicion. Rose's visits brought a hush, a wary energy. She peered around the kitchen, dusted a finger along the mantel, her gaze lingering on June and Walker alike. "A man living alone with a child that ain't his own," she said one morning, slicing apples for pie, "is bound to get folks talking." Walker only grunted, and June kept her head down, but Rose's words hung in the air. It was Ed, back for the branding season, who told June the story she'd never dared to ask. He found her in the barn brushing Blue, the Mustang, nuzzling at her shoulder. Ed leaned against the stall, hat low, and watched her work. "You know why Walker don't like thunder," he said, voice gentle as a prairie breeze. June looked up, silent, waiting. Ed chewed on his words a moment. "He lost a little girl. Long time ago, before you ever came. She was about your age, wild as a rabbit. Her ma left, took the girl, never came back. Storm hit that night, bad as any I ever seen. Walker waited up all night, but the house was empty by morning. He's been empty some ever since." June brushed Blue's mane in slow, careful strokes. "Does he miss her?" "Every day, I reckon. Sometimes the things you lose keep you company longer than the things you keep." Ed's eyes softened. "But he's trying, June. He don't say much, but he don't have to." The knowledge weighed on her, bittersweet as wind over dry grass. She saw Walker with new eyes, how he'd patch her boots, leave an extra blanket at the end of her bed, show her how to read the sky for signs of rain. The quiet things done without asking meant more than any word. Walker started letting June ride Blue down to the creek, her laughter brightening the hollow places in the old house. She taught herself to braid the Mustang's tail, and Rose, seeing the stubborn pride in the girl's shoulders, brought her old calico dress and hemmed it to fit. June felt herself growing, stronger, steadier, anchored to the land and the rough kindness it offered. But every comfort came with its shadow. The town's whispers grew louder, sharp with doubt. Rose's eyes grew worried when June mentioned the men who'd started watching the ranch from the edge of the prairie. Strangers with hats pulled low and horses too fine for honest work. At night, June watched Walker oil his rifle, Ed count the ammunition, Rose lock the eye windows tight. Still, there were moments of peace, sunsets that painted the sky in fire and gold, laughter around the kitchen table, the warmth of a hand on her shoulder as she fell asleep. For the first time in her life, June felt what it meant to belong somewhere, to have a place to return to at the end of each day. And as spring pressed on, with grass pushing green through the scarred earth, June knew she would fight for this fragile, hard-won home. Whatever shadows gathered, whatever tests lay ahead, she would not run. Not anymore. June woke to the sound of horses on gravel, the hush of pre-dawn split by the distant whinny of something uneasy. She crept to the window, heart thudding, and saw torchlight flickering through the cottonwoods at the far fence line. There, half shrouded by morning fog, stood a gang of riders, hard men, the kind who carried their own law wherever they went. In the center, astride a black gelding with a blaze like lightning, sat Tucker Monroe, known in every saloon from here to Carson as Rattlesnake. Walker was already outside, boots on, rifle in hand. He stood by the porch, jaw set, as Ed hurried to his side. Rose peeked out from the kitchen, face pale but eyes sharp. June slipped into her boots and ran to them, refusing to be sent away. Tucker's crew didn't bother with pleasantries. They sauntered up, a smirk on every lip, guns slung low. Tucker grinned, gold tooth flashing. "Mornin', Hale. I hear you still got something that ought to belong to me." Walker's face didn't move. "You're trespassing." Just collecting old debts, Tucker drawled, nodding to the herd. A man can't run forever, not from his past, not from the men who own it. Ed's hand drifted toward his belt, but Walker stopped him with a look. You come for cattle, you're wasting your time. You come for blood, you'll get it. Tucker's smile twisted cruel. Just a warning, Walker. Next time, we won't be so polite. That night, June lay awake, listening for hoofbeats that never faded. She saw new brands burned into the hides of their cattle. By morning, a snake wound through fire. The barn's lock was smashed, a colt gone. In the fields, hoof prints circled like wolves. Rose tried to comfort June, baking sweet bread and telling stories of kinder times. But the girl's eyes were different now. Shadows clung to her. The fear she'd known as hunger was now something sharper, heavier. June helped mend fences with hands that shook, and Ed watched her, sorrow heavy in his voice. Out here, Nina, trouble don't knock. It just comes through the door. For the first time, June felt what it meant to be hunted, to have something or someone who could be taken from her. Walker grew quieter, patrolling the fields at night, his rifle never far from reach. Ed rode the fence line at dusk, shotgun across his lap, cursing the sky for sending old ghosts their way. Even the horses sensed it, ears pinned, restless, waiting. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the hills, June found a message carved into the barn door, a coiled snake, eyes like embers. Beneath it, a single word, soon. She showed Walker without a word. He knelt, hand steady on her shoulder, and met her eyes. You scared? She nodded, swallowing hard. Good, he said, means you're ready. That night, Ed sharpened knives at the kitchen table. Rose prayed softly in Spanish, and Walker cleaned the old shotgun by lamplight. June sat with them, braiding twine for snares, learning that sometimes being a family meant facing the dark together, heads unbowed. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the promise of trouble. But inside, the four of them huddled close, bound not by blood but by something just as strong. The vow that this time no one would be left behind. Night fell with a weight that pressed down on every rafter, every soul. Out in the dark, a wild wind howled, carrying with it the threat of men with fire in their eyes and hate in their hearts. In the barn, June tried to calm Blue, the Mustang's flanks quivering with nerves, nostrils flaring at every creak and rattle. Ed moved among the stalls, murmuring soft in Spanish, fingers tracing old scars on the walls, marks left by other storms, other fights, none quite like this. Walker paced the yard, his silhouette stark against the glow of lanterns. Rose set along the porch rail. Each step measured, every breath thick with anticipation. His side throbbed where an old wound had never healed right, but his grip on the shotgun was unyielding. He had faced drought and wolves and the slow, gnawing hunger of winter, but nothing felt as near or as ruthless as the danger crouched now on the edge of their land. Just past midnight, the peace shattered. Hooves thundered up the drive, too many to count, and shouts cracked the silence. Tucker Monroe and his men burst from the darkness, faces half-masked, eyes alight with malice. They tossed torches, fire catching dry grass, licking up the walls of the hay barn in greedy fingers. Walker fired first, his shot ringing like a warning bell. Ed grabbed a pitchfork. Rose herded June toward the house. Chaos broke like a fever, cattle scattered, gates splintered. June watched as Ed tried to shield Blue, a torch landing too close, flame leaping from straw to mane. In the smoke and panic, a heavy hand grabbed Ed, dragging him back. Tucker's boys laughing, shouting over the roar. June ran before she thought, dodging between shadows, heart hammering so loud she thought it might give her away. She found Walker near the porch, blood seeping from a fresh cut above his brow, rage and pain etched deep. Ed's got taken, she choked, breathless. Walker swore, voice flat, "Get to Rose, get inside." But June couldn't. She couldn't let Ed be lost, not after all they'd survived. She slipped around the burning barn, skirted the chaos, and saw the men hauling Ed toward the corral, tying him to a post, mocking, fists raised. Fear clawed at her, but something stronger burned in her belly. She ran back for help, found Rose loading shells into a battered old rifle. "We can't wait! Ed will die!" June pleaded, and Rose's eyes flared with a resolve that needed no words. Together they crept behind the henhouse, keeping low, while Walker drew the attacker's fire at the front, his silhouette tall and unbroken, even as bullets tore up the dust around him. The sheriff's bell rang out from town. Wilbur had seen the flames, the chaos, and rallied a handful of men. It was enough. In a blur of gunfire and shouts, the tide turned. Tucker Monroe went down, dragged away in chains, face twisted in disbelief. His men scattered, leaving behind blood, smoke, and ruin. But the price was heavy. The barn was gutted, half the cattle gone. Ed bruised and battered, Walker on his knees in the mud, pale as linen. June knelt beside him, shaking, tears streaking her soot-stained face. He looked at her, pain clouding his eyes, and tried to smile. "You did good, kid," he whispered before the fever took him under. That night June and Rose worked by lamplight, tending wounds, cleaning blood, whispering prayers. Outside, the fire burned down to embers. Inside, something hard and bright was forged, a vow, unspoken, that no matter what the world took from them, they would hold fast to each other. By dawn, the storm had passed, but everything was changed. The smell of smoke hung in the air. In the battered quiet, June sat beside Walker's bed, holding his rough hand in both of hers, and waited for the man who'd taught her to stand her ground to find his way back. The sky was pearl gray when June finally drifted into restless sleep, her cheek pressed to the rough cotton beside Walker's fevered hand. The house was quiet except for the low murmurs of Rose boiling willow bark for pain, her steps soft as dust. Ed, battered and limping, sat near the foot of the bed, watching over both of them, guilt etched into every line of his face. When Walker woke, it was to the sound of June whispering in her sleep, her hand still clutching his. He saw the worry carved deep in her brow, the determination that hadn't faltered through the long, burning night. He squeezed her hand gently, and she woke with a gasp, eyes wide, relief breaking across her face like dawn over the hills. "You came back," she said, voice trembling. He tried to smile, but managed only a grimace. "Would have been a fool not to." Rose hovered in the doorway, arms crossed, her sharpness hiding a tenderness she rarely let show. "He'll live," she declared, "but he'll carry that limp longer than he'd like." Ed touched his battered ribs, managed a crooked grin. "We all carry something, señorita." June barely left Walker's side for days, learning to grind herbs, to change bandages without flinching at the sight of blood. She was steadied by the work, the knowledge that her hands, small and scraped, could keep someone alive. Rose taught her to boil linen, to listen for the rattle in a man's chest, to trust that healing came slow but sure, like spring after the longest winter. Walker, propped against pillows, watched her with a new kind of awe. One afternoon, when the sun broke through the smoke-stained glass, he spoke, really spoke, about the things that haunted him. "I've done wrong, June. There's folks I let down, folks I walked away from. If I could go back, I wouldn't turn my back on nobody, not ever again." June held his gaze, her voice small but certain. "If I could choose, I'd still want to be here, with you." Walker blinked hard, and for a moment the distance between them, made of years and regret, dissolved. He reached for her, rough palm warm against her cheek. "You ain't alone. Not now. Not ever." That night, as dusk folded itself around the ranch, June crept out to the porch, blanket over her shoulders. She watched the horizon blaze with gold and purple. The world hushed and knew. Ed joined her, settling on the top step, rolling a cigarette with slow, practiced hands. "She's tough, your Nina," he said, voice low. "She's tougher than me," Walker replied from inside, his voice barely louder than the wind. Rose brought out a lantern, setting it between them. For the first time, laughter sparked in the darkness, a promise that after so much pain, the light could return. When morning came, the house felt changed. June swept the kitchen, humming an off-key tune she remembered from somewhere far away. Rose made coffee strong as thunder. Walker managed to hobble outside, leaning heavy on Ed's arm, to see what remained of the barn. It was nothing but blackened beams, a few charred posts reaching for the sky. June felt tears sting her eyes, but Walker rested his hand on her shoulder, steady. "We'll build it again better this time." She nodded, hope rising like green shoots through ash. In the first light, the ranch didn't look like defeat. It looked like beginning. Trouble never truly left Deadwood Creek. Just circled, waiting for a sign of weakness. By late spring, whispers began curling through the town like smoke. It started with the McKenna family, old landowners with more pride than compassion, filing papers at the courthouse in Reno Junction. They claimed Walker Hale had no rightful deed, that he'd taken in June illegally, that a girl with no kin had no place on land that didn't belong. The news spread fast, fed by tongues that had been itching for fresh scandal. At Rose's schoolhouse, June found herself set apart from the other children, whispers following her like a cold draft. Some called her Charity, others worse. Rose, standing at the blackboard, leveled a gaze sharp as attack at any who dared, but wounds left by words didn't heal with just a look. Back at the ranch, the anxiety was a living thing. Ed spent his days riding the fence lines, scanning for strangers. Rose brought bread and pie as comfort, but her hands trembled more than usual. Walker tried to act unbothered, moving slow but purposeful, but June saw how he lingered by the window, how the lines on his face had deepened. Then the summons arrived, paper folded neat, stamped with the mark of the law. Walker was called to appear at court to defend not only his right to the land, but his right to June. He read the words aloud by lamplight, his voice flat. "If I lose, we lose everything," he said, eyes on June. "And you, they might send you away." June shook her head, stubborn. "They can't. I won't go." Walker smiled, but his worry shone through. "Sometimes it ain't up to us, kid. Sometimes folks who never set foot in your life decide what you deserve." The days leading up to the trial were tense, every minute stretched thin. Rose wrote a letter to her cousin in Reno Junction asking for help. Ed gathered old receipts and yellowed letters, anything that could prove Walker's claim. June cleaned the house, her movements frantic as if she could sweep away the threat with a broom. The morning of the hearing, the whole town gathered at the courthouse. People who'd barely spoken to Walker in years now crowded the steps, eager for spectacle. McKenna arrived with lawyers in tow, sharp-suited men who smelled of cologne and certainty. Walker wore his best coat, still patched at the elbows, June's hand small but steady in his. Inside, the judge looked tired, bored by land squabbles and custody feuds. McKenna's men argued with silver tongues, painting Walker as a squatter, June as a stray. Rose testified on their behalf, her words clear as mountain water. Ed stood, hat in hand, vouching for every fence mended, every acre plowed. When it was June's turn, she rose from the wooden bench, voice shaking but eyes bright. "He didn't take me," she said. "I chose to stay. He's my family. He's the only home I've ever had." The courtroom hushed. For a moment, it seemed even the old clock on the wall stopped ticking. Walker's breath caught in his throat, the weight of loss and hope tangled together. The judge called for recess, promising a decision by sundown. Outside, the air hung thick with worry. Walker pulled June close, his hand heavy on her shoulder. "Whatever happens, I'm proud of you." As the sun dropped behind the red hills, the people of Deadwood Creek waited, hearts pounding, afraid to hope. June clung to Walker's side, determined that no judge, no law, could ever take away what they'd built together. When the wind shifted that evening, carrying the scent of rain and sage, a figure appeared on the edge of the courthouse crowd. Old, stooped, wrapped in a duster coat faded to the color of dry grass. Jeremiah Doc Callahan, white beard tangled down his chest, boots caked in half the counties of Nevada, stepped inside with a limp that spoke of old trails and older regrets. Rose was the first to spot him, and her surprise broke the tension like a dropped plate. "Doc Callahan, where in the devil's name you been hiding?" Doc only tipped his hat, eyes kind beneath the brim. "Been riding a long way, Rosie. Heard this girl needed a friend." Walker blinked in disbelief. "Doc, is it really—" But Doc shook his head, quieting him. "Not time for stories, son." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a battered envelope, sealed with a faded blue ribbon. "Brought something from Grace Whitaker before she passed." The judge, startled by the interruption, called Doc forward. Every head in the room turned as the old man cleared his throat, voice gravelly but steady. "I was with Grace the night she died. She wrote this, her last will and testament, by her own hand. She didn't sell her girl. She trusted her to a good man." A hush swept the room as the judge broke the seal, reading Grace's words aloud. The letter was simple, penned in a shaky scrawl. "To whoever finds this, my June belongs with someone who won't run when the world turns cold. I trust Walker Hale to love her when I'm gone. She's not property, she's hope." The McKenna lawyers sputtered, searching for objections. Doc raised his gnarled finger. "I watched her sign it. I swore on her grave I'd see it delivered." "That's the truth, Judge." For the first time since morning, Walker's shoulders eased just a little. He met Doc's eyes, and something old and heavy passed between them. Regret, forgiveness, and the stubborn promise to do better. The judge asked June if she wanted to speak. She stood, chin lifted, voice trembling but fierce. "I'm not a stray. I belong here, and I want to stay." Rose and Ed both took the stand, their words carrying weight. Ed, voice low but firm, told of the fires and fights, how June risked her life for family she barely knew. Rose spoke of second chances and the strength it took not to run away. When the judge retired to chambers, the courthouse buzzed like a nest of hornets. Some townsfolk grumbled, others nodded, memories of old debts owed to Walker flickering behind their eyes. June found Walker in the hallway, his hands shaking. She pressed hers into his, eyes shining with faith that had cost her everything. "No matter what happens, you're still my pa." Walker's voice broke. "And you're the best part of me." As night pressed against the windows and thunder rolled somewhere beyond the ridge, the town of Deadwood Creek waited. In that suspended hush, hope returned, a wild, dangerous thing, but alive all the same. The rain let up just before sundown, leaving the courthouse steps slick and shining like polished bone. Folks crowded in close, hats in hands, boots muddy from the sudden storm. It was the kind of evening when breath hung on the air, and every heart waited for news that might change a life. The judge returned, coat buttoned, spectacles low on his nose. His face was unreadable, grave as a tombstone. When he spoke, his voice carried through the hush, like thunder over dry land. "In the matter of June, Whitaker and Walker Hale, this court finds no evidence of wrongdoing or unlawful claim. The letter of Grace Whitaker is valid and binding. June remains with Walker Hale as her lawful guardian, and the claim of the McKenna family is dismissed." A murmur swept the room. Some folks gasped, some grumbled, but most just sighed like they'd been holding their breath for years. Rose squeezed June's shoulder, tears in her sharp old eyes. Ed whooped low and rough, clapping Walker's back so hard the man nearly buckled. But the McKenna patriarch wasn't done. Red-faced, voice shaking, he stood and demanded the judge consider additional evidence. He waved a yellowed deed, shouted about heritage and blood rights. The judge silenced him with a look that could freeze a river. "This court is not a stage for old grudges," the judge said, firm. "Land belongs to those who tend it, not those who covet it from afar. The law is clear. Now let these folks be." There was more paperwork, more talk, details that faded like smoke as June threw her arms around Walker, burying her face in his chest. For a long moment he held her close, one hand cradling the back of her head, eyes closed as if in prayer. The townsfolk filed out in twos and threes, some shaking Walker's hand, some tipping their hats, a few even apologizing for things they'd said in darker times. The world outside was changed, a little less cruel, a little more forgiving. On the courthouse steps, Doc Callahan gave June a wink, then pressed a small silver coin into her palm. "For luck, darling, and remember, regret's just a shadow. Step out into the light whenever you can." Walker lingered slow and quiet beside the old judge as the crowd melted away. "You did right by her," the judge said. "Not every man would have stood his ground." Walker's answer was simple. "I reckon sometimes the ground's all a man's got." The family, June, Walker, Rose, Ed, even Doc, walked home together under the washed clean sky, the lights of Deadwood Creek flickering behind them. They moved as one, a little battered but unbroken, knowing that sometimes the greatest battles are won not with bullets, but with stubbornness and love. Spring came early that year, as if the land itself longed for renewal. At the Hale Ranch, green pushed up through blackened earth where the barn once stood. Wild dandelions scattered gold across the fields, softening the memory of ash. Each morning, June ran barefoot through dew-wet grass, her laughter chasing the last of the hard winter from the air. Walker rebuilt the barn with his own hands, Ed at his side, Rose bringing baskets of bread and stories. Doc Callahan stayed on, sharing tricks for easing pain, for patching both wounds and fences. The house was never empty, boots at the door, voices at the table, life humming like a hymn. Some days were hard. Grief had a way of echoing through walls, and even in sunlight, memories sometimes pressed in like shadows at dusk. There were mornings when Walker would stare long at the old photograph of his own lost daughter, and June would sit silent on the porch, tracing circles in the dust. But those moments passed, softened by the rhythm of chores, by simple kindness, a cup of coffee, a braid of wildflowers, a gentle hand on a trembling shoulder. On the first Sunday after the barn was finished, the family gathered around a fire in the yard. The meal was plain, beans, cornbread, Rose's apple pie, but laughter and stories filled the twilight. June, grown stronger in both arm and spirit, sat between Walker and Ed, her head against Walker's shoulder. She looked up at him as the sky faded to deep blue. "If I could go back, I'd still choose you," she whispered. Walker's voice was gruff, gentle as worn leather. "And I'd choose you, little one, every time." They fell quiet, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods, to the night settling over the hills. Doc Callahan poured one last cup of coffee, smiling with something like peace. Rose hummed an old hymn, soft and low, as if to lull the ghosts to rest. Inside, the hearth glowed warm, casting golden light through the window. For the first time in a long while, there was nothing left to run from, no debts, no courts, no storms waiting on the horizon. The house on Deadwood Creek shone like a lantern in the dark, its doors open, its table wide. Walker sat back, his hand covering June's. "We ain't what we started out as," he said, voice rough with love and memory. "But we're here. That's enough." June squeezed his hand, her heart full of something she couldn't quite name, but knew she'd carry all her life. Love made simple by time and forgiveness, and so the ranch endured, battered but unbroken, alive with hope. And every night, when the lamps flickered on and the fields sang with frogs and crickets, there was no question left. No one here would ever be left behind again. If this story touched your heart, drop a 0 or a 1 down in the comments. Let me know you're still here, still riding along with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more Wild West tales about second chances, old regrets, and the kind of courage it takes just to stay. Every story here is a porch light left on for you. Stick around. The next one might just be your favorite yet.